this is Roger, thanks for dropping by. Been asked by a few people how the dodgy Vanda is doing, that we went to great lengths to try and diagnose when the problem occurred. For those who weren't around at that time, basically I have three of the sort of bare-rooted Vandas. They all get watered and fed the same, and they're all in the same place in the grow room, so they're all subject to the same conditions. The other two are fine, and over a very short period the leaves on this appeared like they are bad. It was quite a sudden thing. This didn't happen like over several months. This happened in a very short period of time. The only difference between this Vanda and the other two is this one had a huge bloom spike on it through the winter period, but I don't really think that's relevant. So there were several ideas as to what it might be. Basically, how is it doing now? Well, quite honestly, it's having a good root spurt, including a few new ones from the base. Another one starting there. So it's growing, and its roots are progressing. As I say, there's new sprouts coming out of older roots. There's growing tips in many places. So its roots are doing okay. I haven't got a problem with the root part of the system, if you know what I mean. I mean, Vandas that age, you know, that you've had quite a while or have been around in this world for quite a while, will have older roots. Yeah, and as you can see, right down the base of the plant would be the very oldest roots, and most of the root activity is in the roots that start higher up the stem. So like this one's got some growth on it. This is one of the higher ones, lots of growth, again one of the higher up ones, and the lower roots do often die back, so that's nothing unusual for a Vanda. But what's more important on this Vanda is what's going on at the top. This is not so easy to show at this angle, but the top leaves are okay. Yeah? Now, I'm not sure that leaf has stopped growing or not. I mean, if it has, then it's a small leaf, but it's got another one coming. So the top of the plant is not showing any signs of the damage. And it's strange because cold damage normally hits the outsides of the plant, you know, the tender leaf tips and places like that, whereas most of the damage on this was right down the centre. Some leaves got it a lot worse than others. You know, I mean, that is serious cell damage on there. The whole of the structure of the leaf has gone. These leaves are never going to get better, I'm stuck with them. But if the plant grows and still blooms, you know, so be it. There's no reason to dump it as yet, unless I see things dramatically spreading. But the cell damage on these leaves is not going to get any better. But there's enough green on the leaves to still make them work. And some of the leaves hardly had any damage. I mean, if you look at that leaf, that's not bad, and yet it did get the damage right in there. Again, I think this one's not too bad. So there's plenty of green areas on the leaves that can still photosynthesize. Some suggested back when we were looking at this that these leaves should be cut off. Yes, I could do that, but what would I be left with? Something that is so ugly that I would throw it out. If I started taking all these damaged leaves off, I'd have a bare bit right down through here with no leaves on, and then some of the older tatty ones, if I left them, down the bottom, or I would end up with a bare stalk with half a dozen leaves on the top, which I wouldn't be prepared to keep. So at the moment I'm leaving it alone. I'm just, you know, treating it exactly the same as the others. Still gets watered and fed the same as the others, and the top is actively growing and it's pushing out a lot of new roots. So it just looks bad. So at the moment that's all I'm doing with it. But I do, you know, this gets watered frequently. Most days, I would say. An odd day it gets left, like yesterday, but yeah, I mean, I am keeping my eye on it. When you get cell damage physically, the surface cells on the leaf are damaged. They're quite prone to infections. As I say, that's the worst one, and it's bad. You know, the whole of the surface of that leaf has gone. and it would be prone to infection. But you have to bear in mind it's got one saving grace the way I grow my orchids. I don't get my plants wet. Yes, I've got high humidity in the air, but I don't spray my plants. The leaves don't get wet. And I think in the condition these leaves are, if these leaves did get wet and the water stayed there, it would be one hell of a breeding ground for all sorts of bacterias and infections. So in my case, I don't need to get my plants wet. I keep the air humidity high and the roots hydrated. That's plenty good enough. Yeah, so we may never really know what hit this plant, but although it doesn't look quite right, in my mind I'm sort of 90% sure that this one was just far more susceptible to the lower temperature that I had in here this year. Previous winters I've had my thermostat set at a certain setting. This year I dropped it 2 degrees. Now that doesn't sound a lot, you know, but the difference between a low of 15 and a low of 13 could have just tipped this one over the edge, whereas the other two were just a bit more cold tolerant. So they didn't get the damage. It could be just that, but I'm probably never going to know. But I'm stuck with it. I have no plans on dumping the plant, simply because the blooms on this are quite spectacular, and I still see no reason why this shouldn't bloom. It usually has its first. It had 2 spikes last year. Was it 3? 2 or 3, at least 2 anyway. And the first bloom spike doesn't really start on this plant until it's had exposure to the longer days and the higher temperatures for enough time for it to think it's okay to bloom. So it never blooms early in the year. It seems to bloom once in the middle of the year, and then last year again in the autumn, and that bloom lasted ages all in through the winter. Which anyway, so that's the state of play with it. Plenty of root growth coming out, and including some brand new ones starting at the base, and the top growth looks okay, and it is growing. So it's not stalled or anything like that, you know. So that's it, and I'll continue the way I am at the moment, just feeding and watering as I normally do, the same as the other Vandaceous types, and we'll see how it goes. But I see no reason why it shouldn't progress. And at the moment I have no intentions of taking those leaves off unless they show any signs at all of anything wet and soggy appearing on them, in which case they'll be off like a shot. But yeah, that sort of thing you do have to watch out for, you know. But apart from that, carry on as I am, I think. I see no reason to change what I'm doing at the moment. As I said, if it wasn't growing at the top and there was no sign of new root growth, I'd suspect something serious with the plant. But if it can push out plenty of new roots and still continue to grow at the top, then the plant itself is doing okay. It's just got really bad leaves on it, which I'm stuck with. It's going to be an ugly one from now on. But when it comes into bloom, you can sort of just look at the blooms and forget about the tatty leaves, and it'll look fine when it does that, if it does that. I don't see any reason why it shouldn't. There's no sign of any spikes yet, but I wouldn't expect them yet. I've had this plant a while now, and it never seems to bloom until we get into the sort of midsummer sort of period, when it's had those longer days long enough to trigger it. So possibly just not as cold tolerant as the other two. That's that one then.